What's up guys, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it's a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel, because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about this gorgeous series that is sitting next to me, which is the Hades and Persephone series by Scarlett St. Clair. But before we can do that, please do not forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you have so kindly joined this nerdy community on this corner of the internet, all about Greek mythology, ancient history, and all that kind of fun stuff, let's get into today's video. So the Hades and Persephone series, before we can get into my actual review of it, what the book is about, I need to be very honest with you guys in case you have not been here for a while. If you have been with me on the channel, you've gone through all the ancient texts with me, the Iliad, the Odyssey, you guys have been here from the embarrassing first videos that I put out, which don't survive anymore for good reason, I have deleted them all, then you will know that I actually have a long history with this Hades and Persephone series and with Scarlett. So I did want to start the video by explaining that, just so that you guys know. You guys can then decide if you want to trust me and my opinions in a hot second. I obviously am always very forthcoming about my opinions, even if there are things that I like or I disliked despite knowing the author personally. But let me just explain how far this goes back. So I first started this channel in 2020. Something that I wanted to do, because it was lockdown at the time, was just get into reading again. And up until that point, I hadn't actually read for fun since I was like a teenager. So when I started this YouTube channel, I was looking for books that were inspired by the ancient world, but weren't necessarily retellings. In 2021, I went onto Amazon and I had ordered a bunch of books throughout 2020 to read. And I got onto my Amazon and I had a recommendation from Amazon. Normally, I would look over this shit, right? I'd be like, you don't know me. Don't pretend like you know me and my interests, Amazon. But on this one occasion, I trusted it, and it was A Touch of Darkness. So I clicked on it, and it was by this indie author, Scarlett St. Clair, and it told you a brief synopsis of the book at the time, which again we'll get into in a hot second, and I was convinced enough to buy it. And actually at the time, I did my first ever joint book review, which again does not survive on the channel because it was not good. Now, when I read A Touch of Darkness for the first time, I fell in love. I mean, I plowed through this book. And based off the fact that I just told you I was trying to get into reading again, this was the first book that really took me by the horns and was like, read me, bitch. This is a good story. And so I read it in a whole day, just one day. I just literally did nothing else but read, completely obsessed with it. And so I then actually, mid-reading A Touch of Darkness, ordered Ruin. And I read that in a day as well. I was obsessed. Read then A Game of Fate when that came out, or whatever order it was. I read them all very close together, basically. And at the time, I had 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. So I knew that I wanted to interview authors, went to go see what the deal was with Scarlett. Scarlett only had 2,000 followers at the time on Instagram. And I was like, amazing. So I sent her off a cheeky DM and I was like, hey, I'm a classicist. I'm trying this whole YouTube thing. I would love to talk to you about the Greek mythology used in, these 3 books. And she replied in all caps and was like, hell yes, let's do it. So Scarlett was the first author I ever interviewed. She was the first author that I interviewed who I felt was doing what I was really excited about. I had no idea where this series was going to go and the fact that this whole genre was going to boom off so much. But it was a really exciting time to be there and chatting to her while she was constructing these books and figuring out how to be a full-time author and, going after her dreams and talking about her love of mythology and her real knowledge of mythology. I don't think our first interview was that good editing wise or anything that I did, but the stuff she says in it is just brilliant. I mean, she really, really knew her stuff, and I was really impressed by her not being a classicist and knowing so much about ancient history and about Greek mythology and about even Greek words being used in particular ways. And she just seemed so smart. And so we stayed friends after that. And throughout the years, as these books have come out, she has been sending me digital copies before the physical books come out. I've actually purchased all the physical books myself, but she did send me PDFs prior to books coming out so that I could read them ahead of time. So we do have that relationship. And it's because not only was this series one of the first that really got me back into reading, but also because Scarlett was the first interview I did. So I have a very personal tie to these books and to Scarlett. That was what I was trying to say with that very long ramble so that you understand the whole timeline. You guys can choose to listen to this video, or you can kind of be like, Erica's probably gonna be really biased. If you guys are regulars, you know that I'm not necessarily, even if I know somebody, I'm very okay with being honest. But that's why I wanted to be forthcoming about my relationship with Scarlett and my relationship with this series. But in saying all of that, let me tell you guys a little bit about this series before I can get into my thoughts. And right at the end, I will do some spoilers for A Touch of Chaos, which is the last book in the series. But I will warn you guys when that happens. So up until I tell you spoilers are ahead, you can listen with total safety. So let's get into what the books are about. A Touch of Darkness is not a reimagining and it's not a retelling, but it does use the myth of Hades and Persephone to weave a new fantasy story. It's a whole new fantasy world where you have the gods and the mortals. They live in the same world, but also still very separately. The gods are still very much gods, but the gods have things within the mortal realm that people can, go and enjoy, like clubs or shops. And so we have Hades, who owns a club called Nevernight, and it is notorious for being incredibly difficult to get into. It is really glamorous. It's very because it keeps in line with the underworld, it's very dark, it's like obsidian in color, all of that kind of stuff that we now love about when it comes to people taking Hades again and sort of reimagining him or, putting him into different environments. It's always this dark kind of underworld, you don't understand me sort of character. He owns his club Nevernight, and Persephone, who is the goddess of spring, but is not publicly the goddess of spring, she has lived in a greenhouse her whole life. Her mother, Demeter, has kept her prisoner, basically, in this greenhouse, and she has lived there to protect her from the rest of the gods, supposedly, right? That's what Demeter has told her, that the world is really ugly, the world is really horrible, you can't go outside. Finally, Persephone reaches the age of 18 to go to university, and her mother agrees that she can go out into the real world as long as she masquerades as a mortal. So that's what she does. And when she's at university, this nightclub Nevernight is this hot place to be. Her best friend ends up getting them in one night, and Persephone goes and accidentally gets into a game of poker with Hades himself. Now, this is a problem because if Hades wins a bet, he will then challenge whoever it is to, overcome something or do something that seemingly is impossible. And he does that to Persephone. He tells her that she must create life in the underworld. So for 6 months, she has this deal and she has a timeline in order to do it. And she can go in and out of the underworld as she pleases to try and create life down there. But it's the goddess of spring who has never really had to utilize her powers. She actually doesn't know how. And so the main story of the first book is, as you guys can tell, taking that myth of Hades and Persephone, the idea of entrapment in the underworld. So he traps her into a deal. He traps her into this game. They have a 6-month-long contract for it. Very inspired by the ancient myth of Hades and Persephone. But the series is romance, and something that I loved about my first interview with Scarlett is that she acknowledged that she had changed a really horrible myth to be a really lovely romantic story because that was what she wanted to do. But aside from that first book, A Touch of Darkness, the rest of them aren't retellings or reimaginings or any kind of taking a general Greek myth in the way that the first book did and respinning it. They are really just fantasy completely. So I did just want to let you guys know right up off the bat, it is Hades and Persephone from the first one, and even though they are the main characters in the entire series, this is certainly not an extension of that myth. It then becomes Scarlett's own fantasy romance world, just with the Greek gods sort of at the helm of this world. Now, the series is actually split into 2 halves. So all the books that are sitting next to me that you can see, which is A Game Of, those are from Hades' perspective. And then you have A Touch Of, which are all from Persephone's perspective. All apart from the last book, the newly released A Touch of Chaos, this is both perspectives. So these are really split up into the exact same books from 2 different perspectives. And that's because both characters are so interesting. I mean, literally, there's wacky shit going on in both of their stories. From Persephone to Hades, Persephone trying to find herself after being trapped in this greenhouse, having a horrible relationship with her mother, that whole storyline and trying to figure that out, that's what she does on her side of the series, that she's figuring out what she wants, how she wants to do it. She's Also figuring out how to be a goddess, how to be a public goddess, and how to be a good friend. I mean, all of these things that she never had to learn, that's her side. Whereas when we get to Hades, I mean, this man is doing the labors of fucking Hercules. And that is not me, by the way, over dramatizing it. He's literally doing the labors throughout his books. So there's a lot going on. And then you finally get to Chaos, which is then the last one of both of them. But it is, like I just said, purely fantasy. Now, because the books are split into two halves of the same series, people on the internet have become divided about whether they prefer Hades or they prefer Persephone's side of the story. And from my personal perspective, I do not think you can choose a side because they're so different. And the reason that I think that is because you're going to relate to both of them in different moments. And both characters have to go through certain things that I understand when those books came out, people didn't really get, but hopefully they will get in Chaos, because everything makes much more sense once we get that final installment and once we know why Persephone has to act in a certain way, or why she needs to learn that specific lesson, why Hades has to do this specific thing, why he needs to learn how to fight this creature, or whatever it happens to be. All of that does culminate into a touch of chaos and finally kind of lets everything make a lot more sense and becomes more clear. In my opinion, anyways. If you guys have different opinions, obviously let us know in the comments below. If it's going to have anything spoilery, do make sure that you leave a disclaimer at the top of the comment, because otherwise I will delete them. I do not want any spoilers for anybody. So when it comes to the mythology side of things, I was so impressed after the first book how much mythology is infused and how much odd mythology is infused within these books. You know, as I said, Hades goes off on a whole rampage to do his labors of Heracles, or, you know, Hercules, depending on which name you'd prefer to say. But he goes off and does his whole labors, and there's just so much stuff that it's not necessarily only the labors that he does, but it's also things that are thrown into it, like the labyrinth that Knossos is thrown in. I won't say what book that is or where it is, but that's thrown into it. We have, chariot racing games that are thrown into the series at one point. Again, I'm trying really hard not to pinpoint where those things are. Funeral rites are also included. I mean, there is so much fun stuff that is included in these books. So much odd mythology. Lots of the Iliad and lots of the Odyssey. If you guys are fans of those books, if you guys have watched my series on those, there were so many nuggets from both of those. There were obviously nuggets from everywhere else. Really lovely nods to Virgil as well, surprisingly, in Chaos. And I just think that there was so much stuff that is thrown in there that I think it's such a fun series for people who are not as bogged down in mythology, but also for us who are, because there are so many nuggets that we're going to get that other people aren't going to get, or other people are going to assume that Scarlett made it up. And lots of wacky things that happen that as you're reading it, so much of it was like, yeah, that is what Apollonia said. So, I mean, she's not wrong. It seems weird, but there it is. It's just a series that is just so brilliant. And I think is just so unmatched in the way that it weaves mythology into a modern fantasy story, whilst also letting Scarlett be a fictional writer. And I did want to stress that because it is fantasy at the end of the day. It is fictional. It is not a whole myth, but it does throw in so much stuff that it becomes like this weird, wacky world that allows Scarlett to be as creative and as wonderful and as brilliant as she has been throughout this series, whilst also showing so much Greek mythology and the wackiness of Greek mythology, I guess, at the same time. So I do highly recommend this series to everybody and anybody. I really can't say enough how much I love it. Like, genuinely, I think that it would just be redundant if I continue this video to just say, I love it. Because I do, and I say it all the time on my social media, and you guys know where you can find the links in the description below. But I am not done yet, because I do want to have my spoiler moment. So, again, you guys can find links in the description below. If you have not read this series, particularly if you haven't read A Game of Gods and you haven't read A Game of Fate, A Touch of Chaos, even. So if you haven't read A Game of Gods and you haven't read A Touch of Chaos and you are tuning in, now is your time to switch off the video I'll see you guys next time with more book reviews here on MoAn Inc. And I am just going to patiently sit here waiting to give you all enough time in case, because I know a bunch of you just kind of play the video in the background and you guys probably walked away from it. You have like your AirPods in or whatever headphones you have in. Go back to the video, pause it, do whatever you need to do. I'll wait. We'll wait. Don't you worry. Okay, now that it's just us nerds here, let's get into some spoilers about A Game of Gods and A Touch of Chaos. A Game of Gods is by far my favorite in the series. And the reason why I didn't want to put this in the other one is because I don't know how to talk about A Game of Gods without ruining A Touch of Chaos. So that's why. But A Game of Gods, I wonder if Scarlett is still listening to this. I'm sending it to her, so definitely she should. But when it came to A Game of Gods, Scarlett sent me this book. And she sent me the PDF in May, like early May of last year. She was like, have fun, read it, I hope you enjoy it. And when I read it, I loved it so much that I didn't actually tell her how much I loved it. And the reason is because I was so blown away by A Game of Gods that I didn't know if it was indicative of the fact that I was in like a reading rut at the time and Gods was just so good. And so maybe I was like, oh, maybe it's kind of shrouded by the fact that I'm not really liking anything I'm reading at the time. Or maybe I was like, do I have like a really weird reaction to this book? Is it going to be weird if I just scream at Scarlett through DMs or I sent her a voice note screaming or whatever? So I was like, okay, I need to think about this more. Like, before you tell Scarlett anything, think about this more. And I thought about this damn book for like 6 months. I mean, I was just blown away by the idea that Scarlett had infused, all of the Maenads, Dionysus Maenads, as these kind of like warriors, these assassins. See, this is why I can't put it in the regular side of the video because I don't know if people know that or not. But, I love that element of it. I completely love Dionysus' point of view entirely. I mean, his whole storyline with Ariadne in Gods had me in a chokehold. I mean, you guys, it was unhealthy. The attention that I was giving to those characters, the attention that I was giving to those chapters, anytime it was like Dionysus was in a scene, I was like, where's Ariadne? Where's Ariadne? Why aren't you demanding that she falls in love with you yet? Hell, hold on! Like, oh my God, it was unhealthy. It was unhealthy. And that's why I struggled so much to message Scarlett about it. Because I was like, at what point am I the weirdo? Like, at what point do I have to just kind of sit down and be like, Erica, this is a problem. You're a problem. So I loved Gods for those reasons. I loved Dionysus chapters, obsessed with him and Ariadne. But also I loved just the overall storyline of Gods. I loved throwing in like the odd monsters that were thrown in. I loved like all of the side quests that were going on in that book. And also because when it got to Gods, I knew ahead of time, because Scarlett had told me, that it was going to be more than just Hades' perspective. Right? You guys who have stuck around, you guys know it's all just Hades and then just Persephone. And then suddenly we get to Gods and it's Hades, Theseus, and Dionysus. I understood why we needed Theseus. I was really, really apprehensive about Dionysus. I didn't say this to Scarlett, but I was a bit like, why do I need Dionysus' point of view? And also, what does he have to offer to the story outside of kind of like the snarkiness that we had already seen from his perspective? And so I just didn't know. I feel really bad saying this, but I didn't know if it was going to ruin the series for me. And it tends to be because whenever I find that authors, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but whenever I find that authors include more than two characters' perspectives, it tends to water down my relationship with those characters. But in this instance, it worked really well. And I think it worked really well because we had already had so many books with Hades that by the time it got to Gods, we did need Hades' perspective, but I knew him so well at that point that to add in Dionysus, it was actually the perfect moment. And I didn't realize that until I was reading Gods, that the book wouldn't have worked as just Hades' perspective. Like, it definitely needed the other two perspectives, and Dionysus was such a brilliant character to bring in as his little side quest with all of his assassin ninja people. That whole thing I just thought was brilliant, and it just added a layer of like, he's kind of on Hades' side, but he's not really on Hades' side, and I loved it. I loved Gods. I think too much about this series. I need you guys to know this, okay? This is what I do in my spare time. I'm just sitting there being like, how do I feel? Why do I like this? Why do I not like this? Anywho, I didn't know if I was gonna like Gods when I had read Chaos. I thought maybe Chaos was going to overshadow it, or I thought maybe I would then go back on the idea of multiple perspectives. Because for Chaos, we knew well ahead of time that it was going to be Theseus, Dionysus, Persephone and Hades. So it's gonna be 4 perspectives in one book. And I was a bit like, oh, I don't know if I want to say that I love gods and then read chaos and be like, actually, back to what I was thinking before. This is too much. It's not gonna work. It worked beautifully. Chaos literally took over my life for the last 2 days. And it only took me so long to read because I have work to do. It was one of those that I bought the book and I was like, God damn it, why do I have a call scheduled for today? I had an interview yesterday. You know, I was like, I have too much shit going on to have chaos drop on this day. So it did take me 2 days to read the 600 pages. And my review of chaos, when it comes to, you know, the mythology, obviously it's fantasy at this point. It's totally fantasy, and it's just kind of using all the mythology up to here. I loved the extra elements of Apollonius, which are thrown in. I thought that was really, really clever. I loved the wheat warriors. Love them because I call them wheat warriors. So when Scarlett was like, oh, the wheat warriors are there. It looks like wheat, but they're about to sprout. I was like, oh my God, yeah. Like, that's how I see them too. So I loved that inclusion. And also when it came to chaos, I think because this is a romance series and it is such a big fantasy series, like it is such a serious fantasy series in my opinion, that, how do I phrase this? The romance was in there, but unlike a lot of the other books where like, you know, you were waiting for it, this was the only book that when the romance scenes came into it, I was like, hurry up, there are bigger things to be dealing with. And Scarlett, I think, knew that her reader was going to be like that. And so therefore there aren't as many in chaos, and we focused more so on this crazy storyline of how is this going to come to fruition? How are we going to come to a resolution in any kind of way? Like the way that this whole series has been in regards to, you know, building up these weapons that Theseus has been acquiring and the prophecy that Theseus knows and etc., etc., etc. I did not understand how anybody was going to come out alive. And as I was reading chaos, I was like, well, this explains why everybody's dying. Because it makes no sense. And I think that was what was so brilliant about the ending. Like, as you go through the book and like, Hera is just killed. Zeus is just killed. I was like, excuse you, Scarlett. Who the fuck? What? What? I mean, she went full Game of Thrones, but in a way that I think if all of those characters had like lived, it wouldn't have made any sense because they were doomed. Like all of them were doomed from the start, from the get-go of chaos. I was like, sayonara. It was nice knowing you, you know? And especially when it came to the characters like Apollo, Hera, and Zeus, the only way that I could see them even coming back, which Scarlett didn't do, but the only way I could see them coming back was like, oh, maybe the way that they win this war is that because all the souls are dead, then Hades can like raise an army from the dead, and maybe then that's how they defeat Theseus. And obviously you guys who know the book, who have read the books, that's why you're still here, that's like not what happened in it at all. But it was just a beautiful resolution, a beautiful conclusion to the story. And I think that's something that maybe a lot of people might miss. I haven't really seen the reaction to it because obviously this is filmed on the second day that it's been released to the world. So I haven't seen people review it yet. But when it comes to the idea of the prophecy being that Theseus will, or whoever acquires all of these gifts, is going to have a victory over the gods. And the way that they reinterpret that, the way that Hecate shows up and she reinterprets that. And she's like, well, you know, maybe it's a victory like a game, like go play a game with him kind of a thing. It's such a brilliant nod to the way that prophecies would have been told and reinterpreted in the ancient world that I think a lot of people might miss. Prophecies in the ancient world are so wacky, like they're so weird and they're so generic. And like there's a really famous one from the Persian Wars where the Greeks were told that they will defeat the Persians with wooden walls. Right? And we know from the histories that, you know, the Greeks are like, what does this mean? What are we going to do? What kind of walls are we going to build? And blah, blah, blah. The prophecy meant boats, people, okay? But they didn't realize that. And it's this glaring idea of like, well, we must build these giant walls. They have to be wooden, apparently, because that's what the prophecy said. And it was a stupid boat. Stupid. Okay, it wasn't stupid because they won the war, but you know what I mean. And so this idea of Hecate coming and reinterpreting it to being something so simple and something so glaringly obvious, but obviously wouldn't have been the first thing that anybody thought of, I thought was such a beautiful way of tying in a really naturally Greek mythology, ancient world conclusion and resolution that allowed, obviously, as you guys know, it allows Hades to go in, to get close to Theseus, to play fucking dominoes. Why he chose dominoes is still beyond me. Like, play fucking Jenga or something. I was like, dominoes, Theseus, what? But, you know, they go and they play dominoes, and that gives Hades the chance to then poison Theseus. So the prophecy is then concluded. The prophecy comes true, and then also he dies, which is, it was so simple and so brilliant that finally when that happened, I was like, there it is. That's our ending. They're done. Beautiful. What? I loved it. I would be really curious to hear about your perspectives of that ending, about that conclusion. You know, maybe it's just because I'm very familiar with the ancient world that I was like, that is such a natural place for Scarlett to go, and such a brilliant way for her to conclude everything, and for her to wrap up this story in a really natural way without it being like and then they defeated everybody and it was all okay kind of a thing, which it could have happened, right? I've read series where that happens, where all of a sudden, you know, it was the army of the dead or something that I had predicted it was. Thank fuck it wasn't. Thank fuck it wasn't. You know, it could have been something like that, and Scarlett very much rejected that, and she wrote a really brilliant, simple, yet complex ending. And I loved it. So you guys can find all the links in the description below, and I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments. So again, as I've said multiple times in this video, do not forget to put a disclaimer at the start of your comment if you want to chit chat, because I will be deleting any that don't have that. I don't think it's right to spoil things for people that don't want to have anything spoiled for them. And so with all that being said, this was incredibly, incredibly long, but I feel like it was worth it. I feel like it was worth getting into the chit chat, to getting into the drama, and hopefully, you know, we can have like a little space here on MoAn for us just to appreciate Scarlett's work. You guys can find Scarlett's interviews that I've done with her in the description below as well. And I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. So I'll see you guys then.